Dark clouds loomed over the battlements of Winterfell, and a chill wind raked across the courtyard. It was the same wind that had borne tidings of war from the south, a wind carrying the distant echoes of marching armies and the whispered rumors of a queen's unrelenting ambition. Jon Snow stood near the ramparts, clad in a heavy cloak lined with fur. His gaze traveled over the wide stretch of land beyond the walls. Though spring was in the air, the north still clung to its last vestiges of winter, and the ground below remained hard with frost. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a measured breath, he turned back and regarded the figure next to him. Arya Stark was dressed in leathers, her small compact figure exuding an alert poise and restless energy. She had grown so much since the days when they were children, sparring with wooden swords in secluded corners of the castle. Now, there was something in her eyes. Something sharpened by the roads she had traveled, the secrets she had learned, and the transformations she had undergone. She was a fighter, a survivor, a master of stealth and blade. And she was his sister, or cousin, as they'd all come to learn, though the blood ties and the bond they shared proved unbreakable, regardless of the new revelations. They exchanged a silent look, and neither needed words to acknowledge the weight of the task before them. It wasn't so long ago that all the North had rallied to defeat the threat of the undead, uniting under a single purpose: the fight for life. That fight was over now, but fresh conflict loomed. A different enemy, just as dangerous in her own way, had to be confronted. Cersei Lannister held the Iron Throne, and her ambition to keep it was equaled only by her ruthlessness. The forces loyal to Jon and his allies would need to reckon with her. There was no alternative, not after what she had done, and not if the North was to enjoy the peace it deserved. Arya exhaled softly. "They're waiting for us," she said, nodding toward the steps leading to the great hall. Jon inclined his head and followed her inside. The warmth of the hall greeted them, torches lining the walls and braziers, placed strategically to chase away the lingering cold. A hush fell over the crowd as Jon and Arya entered. Gathered around the long tables were the lords and ladies of the North, their numbers bolstered by a scattering of loyal advisors who had once served Daenerys Targaryen or had joined Jon's cause after the Great War. Some were men and women of high birth, others commanded small but loyal forces. All had pledged themselves to the struggle soon to come. At the head of the room, Sansa Stark rose from where she sat. She offered Jon and Arya a nod, and they returned the gesture. Though she was not leading this war council directly, Jon and Arya were the ones to do so. Sansa's support was essential. She carried influence among the northern houses that had come to trust her measured counsel. Her presence was both reassuring and formidable. Jon stepped forward, feeling the eyes of everyone upon him. He drew in a breath and thought of the best words to shape their resolve. He thought of all of the times he had stood on the brink of war, how no speech could truly capture the fear or hope of what lay ahead. But still, he had to try. "You know why we're here," he began, his voice carrying through the hall. "We've ended one war, only to face another. Cersei Lannister has made it clear she intends to keep the throne by any means necessary. We all know what that means. We've seen what she's capable of. How she betrays agreements, how she uses wildfire and gold, how little she cares for common folk so long as she sits on that throne." A dull murmur passed through the onlookers. He saw a few heads nod in grim agreement. Others looked uncertain, as though they still reeled from the idea of venturing south again, so soon after the horrors they had endured. Jon pressed on. "The war isn't just about who sits in King's Landing. It's about whether we allow cruelty and fear to rule the Seven Kingdoms, or whether we strive for something better. Some of you might wonder if it's worth fighting another war when we've barely survived the last. I understand that doubt, but we must stand against tyranny or risk letting it spread." He felt a subtle shift in the crowd. Some, including a few younger lords, looked emboldened, while others, especially the older or more cautious, looked worried. Arya cleared her throat, stepping forward with that quiet confidence she had acquired, like a shadow hidden until it chose to reveal itself. "We've all fought battles we never dreamed we'd face," she said, her voice cool yet firm. "We've learned that underestimating a threat can be our undoing. Cersei will send her armies north eventually if she feels threatened by us. She's lost many allies, but she won't be alone. We have to prepare. And we have to strike, if we're forced to. A chorus of agreement rippled through the hall, though it was tinged with apprehension. Lady Brienne of Tarth stood at the periphery of the assembly, her broad shoulders and steadfast posture conveying her unwavering loyalty. She caught Arya's eye and gave her a respectful nod. Not far from her was Sir Davos Seaworth, his face lined with concern and experience. He had seen more battles than most, and still stood ready to give counsel. Jon beckoned them all closer, inviting them to gather around the nearest table. There, a large map lay, depicting the breadth of the 7 kingdoms in careful detail. The edges were worn from previous war councils, lines and inks scrawled in strategies devised against different foes at different times. Now, new plans would have to be made, new routes decided upon, and new alliances sought. First, we need to assess our forces, Jon said. What remains of the northern armies, the Knights of the Vale, those who remain loyal to the memory of Ned Stark, or to the cause of a freer, safer realm. He tapped the northern region on the map, then swept his hand toward the Vale and onward to the Riverlands. We also have some support from the Riverlands, though we need to confirm their readiness. A heavy-set lord with a weathered face, Lord Glover, cleared his throat. He had once broken faith with Jon but had come around in the final war. We've taken stock of the soldiers who survived, he said. They're not many, but they're determined. The Great War took its toll. We need time to replenish our numbers, to train new recruits. He glanced at Jon, then at Arya. Is there time for that, truly? Arya's brow furrowed with a thoughtful crease. We can't rush untrained men into battle, she replied, her voice steady. Each life is too precious. But we might not have the luxury of waiting too long either. Our enemies will not be idle. Sir Davos, standing with his arms folded, added in his low, gravelly tone. Cersei's approach is often cunning. She'll try to isolate us, perhaps by bribing or threatening our potential allies. If we wait too long, we risk letting her weave her webs of gold and promise. Jon nodded. We need to find a balance then. Long enough for us to prepare, not so long that we lose advantage. The group broke into pockets of discussion. The lords debated how many men they could spare, who might be assigned as captains, how to coordinate supplies. Voices rose and fell, but always the looming presence of the war overshadowed every syllable. Jon studied them quietly, letting the conversation flow, mindful of the trust he needed from these people who had already given so much. During a lull, Sansa spoke from where she stood, her voice carrying a calm and cool authority. The Vale has proven loyal, in part due to Petyr Balish's manipulations. But now that he's gone, the knights serve as they see fit. My dealings with Lord Royce suggest he still feels bound to House Stark, out of respect if nothing else. I believe if we ask for his help, he will lend it. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the men and women present. But we need more than knights and swords. We must think about supply lines. Winterfell can't shoulder this alone. The Tyrells once controlled the breadbasket of Westeros, but we know what happened to Highgarden. We can't rely on that harvest. We must look to the Riverlands or beyond, perhaps the Stormlands, if Lord Gendry Baratheon is willing to help. Jon's lips twitched at the mention of Gendry. He remembered the boy as a loyal companion, forging weapons from dragonglass. Now, he was recognized as the last Baratheon, given Storm's End by the late Queen Daenerys. If Gendry had not turned sour at the events that transpired, he might indeed be open to assisting the Starks. It was something to consider. One of the smaller lords, a gaunt man with tired eyes, spoke hesitantly. Pardon me, but is there a risk Lord Gendry might have joined forces with King's Landing, seeing as he's newly seated in his castle? Arya's expression grew thoughtful, her eyes flickering with memories only she knew. Gendry isn't one to forget where he came from, or who stood beside him when times were darkest. If he's left to decide on his own, I believe we can count on his aid. But I'd like to speak with him personally before we assume his loyalties. Nappy, I'm she. There was a murmur of agreement. The question of alliances, while vital, remained uncertain. A hush fell briefly, then was broken by Lady Brienne's clear voice. What of the Lannisters? Tyrion Lannister was last seen heading somewhere discreet, if the rumors hold true. We know he has no love for his sister. If he still lives, he might bring men or knowledge to our cause. Jon exchanged a glance with Arya. Tyrion's fate had been unknown after the chaos of King's Landing months before. If he still drew breath, he would surely be on the run, or hidden somewhere, waiting to see how the realm would reshape itself. If he chose to surface, it could tip the scales, but that was a speculation Jon couldn't rely on. He pressed his lips together, inhaling quietly. "We can't build a plan on the hope of Tyrion appearing," he said. "He'd be an asset, but we need a strategy that stands on its own." Arya's fingers traced a faint line along the map, moving southward. "Cersei will likely garrison her forces in the Crownlands, around the capital. But she'll also be wary of assault from land or sea. She may try to fortify the Blackwater. We should expect that. Or she might move to destroy any encroaching threat in the Stormlands, or the Reach, if she fears we'll make alliances there." "No." Her voice took on a faint, reflective note, as though she recalled the narrow passages and hidden ways of King's Landing. She had once walked there unseen, learning how to vanish in a crowd or slip past guards unnoticed. That knowledge, while valuable, would only get them so far in an all-out war. Gradually, the conversation pivoted to the pressing matter of how to engage Cersei's forces. Some argued for a slow and steady march south, garnering alliances as they went. Others suggested a swift strike at King's Landing before Cersei could fully marshal her defenses. The debate churned on, voices rising, tempers flaring. Jon raised a hand for silence, and slowly, the voices died down. "This war can't be won by brute force alone," he said. "We can't simply batter the gates of King's Landing. Too many innocent people would suffer, and we'd risk a siege that could last indefinitely. We need to be cunning. We need to strike where Cersei's hold is weakest. If we can draw some of her forces away, force her to divide her armies, then we might have a chance to take the city with minimal bloodshed." "There." Some nodded in agreement, while a few lords pursed their lips, still uncertain. Arya's expression hardened slightly. She was never one to shy away from decisive action, but she too had learned caution. "We'll reconvene again soon," she said after a moment. "But for now, let us all gather the best intelligence we can. We need to know where her forces are stationed, who her allies are, where her supply lines run. We'll coordinate with scouts, send ravens, and use every scrap of information we can get." Nassen. With that, the meeting reached a natural pause. People began filtering from the Great Hall, speaking in hushed tones among themselves, forming plans for contacting allies or gathering their levies. A few approached Jon and Arya directly, offering whatever help they could muster, or quietly voicing their fears. Brienne lingered by the map, glancing over the positions one last time. "I'll work with our best scouts," she offered, looking at Arya with that serious, unwavering stare of hers. "We'll find out what we can about any Lannister movements toward the Riverlands. Perhaps we can secure a meeting with Lord Edmure Tully. He's long sought the chance to restore peace after the wars that ravaged his lands." Arya nodded appreciatively. "Thank you," she said. "Your help will be invaluable." Jon, meanwhile, spoke quietly with Sir Davos and Lord Glover about rationing and ensuring that any journey south would have adequate provisions. In a war as large as this, a shortage of food could be as deadly as any sword thrust. When most had departed the Great Hall, leaving only a few scattered servants to clear the tables, Jon and Arya found themselves at the map once more, the flickering torchlight casting wavering shadows over its surface. Sansa joined them, her hands folded in front of her. She studied them both. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "Both of you. Leading a war council isn't easy. We've all seen enough conflict for a lifetime." Arya's lips pressed into a tight line. "That doesn't make it any easier. But we have no choice." "Nay." Sansa gave a barely perceptible nod, her gaze sliding over the lines that represented the roads to King's Landing. "No, we don't." They stood there in silence for a time, the quiet companionship of siblings who had once been separated by so much. At length Jon murmured, "We should rest. Tomorrow we'll begin gathering our forces in earnest. We'll plan the next meeting. There's a long road ahead." The hours that followed were a restless swirl. Word spread through the corridors of Winterfell like a cold draft, and soon every inhabitant knew that another war loomed on the horizon. The smiths worked late into the night, forging new swords and repairing battered armor. Stewards rushed about, conducting inventories of grain and salted meats. Stable hands prepared the horses for the journeys that might come, brushing their coats and ensuring they were well fed for the roads ahead. Jon took a moment to visit Ghost, the albino direwolf who had faithfully followed him through battles unnumbered. Ghost greeted him with a soft, throaty rumble, nuzzling Jon's arm in a gesture of quiet comfort. Jon stroked the direwolf's thick fur, letting the warmth of the creature ground him. It reminded him of the countless times he'd braced himself for war, whether beyond the wall, at Castle Black, or in the fields before Winterfell. Each time, he never truly felt ready. This time was no different. He whispered to Ghost, his voice scarcely more than a breath. "Things never get simpler, do they, boy?" The direwolf merely blinked at him with those red eyes, an enigmatic sentinel who asked for no explanation. Jon lingered a moment longer before he tore himself away, unwilling to let the doubt and fear in his heart slow him. Meanwhile, Arya roamed the castle as she often did, quietly, her footfalls near silent on the stones. She slipped into corners and corridors unnoticed, watching, listening. She passed by the armory and saw a small group of young recruits practicing with wooden swords under the dim glow of lanterns. A pang struck her chest. Once, she had been that child, longing for a different path than the one expected of her, training in secret so no one would see. She lingered a while, observing their movements, gauging which among them showed promise. One day, they might need the skill to defend themselves, to defend this home. The recruits were so focused they didn't even notice her presence. A swirl of memories washed over her. Bravos, the house of black and white, the face she wore when she took a life. She shoved those recollections aside and slipped away, gliding through the castle's winding halls until she reached her chamber. There, by dim candlelight, she began cleaning and sharpening her dagger, her sword needle lying nearby. Each scrape of the whetstone reminded her of what lay ahead. She allowed herself a moment of quiet regret that the realm was once again on the brink of bloodshed. But she was no stranger to necessity. They could not bow to a tyrant. Outside, the night deepened. The moon rose behind thick clouds, offering only fleeting glimmers of silver light. Ravens perched on the rooftops, as though waiting for the messages they would soon carry. The air was still, burdened by unspoken dread. Yet within the walls, hearts burned with determination. The north would not bend lightly again. At dawn, a weak sun struggled to pierce the haze of cloud. The castle sprang to life with renewed urgency. The War Council would not meet again until they had fresh intelligence. But many tasks still demanded attention. Arya joined Brienne and a contingent of scouts in the courtyard. There, the Knights of the Vale had mustered a handful of men who were skilled in reconnaissance, along with a few of the Stark Guard who knew the North's hidden trails better than any cartographer. Brienne inspected each scout with a discerning eye. "We need speed and stealth," she said, her voice carrying. "Your orders are simple. Travel into the Riverlands, speak with their lords, find out whether any sign of Lannister troops has been spotted. Listen for whispers of mercenaries, any deals being struck. If possible, learn about the supply caravans traveling south." She paused, and her gaze moved over the soldiers. "Keep your heads low. Avoid conflict. We need information, not casualties." Arya stepped forward. "If you learn anything about Lord Edmure or the Tullys, make sure to convey that we wish for a council. We'll meet them at a location of their choosing. However, do not linger too long anywhere. We can't risk losing you." The scouts affirmed their understanding, and soon they rode out in pairs, slipping through Winterfell's gates into the pale morning light. Arya watched them go, a flurry of movement across the drawbridge, disappearing beyond the first bend of the road. She hoped they would return safely. War thrived on knowledge, and any advantage might mean fewer lives lost. As the scouts departed, Jon oversaw the training of some of the newer recruits, stepping into the courtyard with Sir Davos at his side. The older knight watched with an uneasy expression. "They're green, these lot," he murmured. They have heart, but that might not be enough. Jon grimaced. I know. We'll have to rely more on disciplined veterans for the brunt of the fighting. But these men and women could still play vital roles, guard duty, or supporting positions. We need every able body if Cersei's got the Golden Company, or any other sellswords. The mention of the Golden Company recalled the memory of how Daenerys once faced them during her siege of King's Landing. Times had changed, but the brutality of mercenaries would remain the same. Davos sighed, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. Times like these I can't help but wish there was another way. But here we are, with war at our doorstep again. Named one to Betty. Jon gave a tight nod. He too wished for another solution, but with Cersei on the throne, negotiation was unlikely to yield anything but betrayal. She had shown time and again her disregard for oaths and alliances. If the realm was ever to know peace, they had to challenge her rule. By midday, ravens had departed Winterfell, carrying messages throughout the north, the Vale, and hopefully to Storm's End. Arya penned a brief but pointed letter addressed to Gendry Baratheon, the words carefully chosen. A summons of sorts, asking for his presence, or at least his reply. She did not include the exact details of their war council, nor the numbers of their forces. Such things were better left uncommitted to parchment. Instead, she offered an olive branch of friendship and a subtle reminder of the debt they owed each other. As the raven took flight from the rookery, its wings beating against the crisp northern air, Arya stood watching it disappear into the sky. She couldn't shake a ripple of anticipation. So much rested on how others would respond. Allies could tip the balance, and the knowledge that Gendry might help them steadied a portion of her anxiety. Throughout the corridors, Sansa quietly reassured House representatives who approached her with trepidation. Some were worried about the young men being conscripted. Some feared famine if the conflict dragged on. Sansa bore these concerns with a measured calm, reminding them of the cunning logistic plans they had formed. The stored grain they had gathered after the Great War, and the lines of trade still open across the Vale. She was no stranger to the complexities of governance, and used her influence to keep morale from crumbling under the weight of potential war. That evening, Jon, Arya, and Sansa retreated to the Solar, a smaller room warmed by a single fireplace. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. A tapestry of House Stark's direwolf sigil draped one of the walls, swaying faintly in the draught. The siblings sat around a small table, candlelight dancing across their faces. There were no lords or ladies here, no formality, just the three of them grappling with what lay ahead. Sansa traced her finger along the rim of her wooden goblet. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice subdued. "If we march south, who remains here to hold Winterfell? We can't leave it vulnerable." Jon ran a hand through his dark hair, which had grown longer again. "We'll have to leave a garrison," he agreed, "and not a small one. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that leaving your seat unprotected invites trouble. The North needs stability." Arya spoke softly. "I'll go. You know that. I want to be part of this from the start." Sansa's gaze flicked to Arya, and in her eyes flickered both pride and a hint of worry. "I know. I just..." She paused. "You've both seen enough danger for several lifetimes. I don't want to lose either of you again." Jon's features softened. "We're not children anymore, Sansa. We've been shaped by these battles. We'll be careful, but we can't hide from what must be done." Knock. The fire crackled, its embers glowing brightly. Outside, the wind hissed, as though the north itself lamented another looming conflict. The three of them fell silent for a time, the heaviness palpable. A shadow moved at the edge of the corridor. Someone passing by, discreetly leaving the siblings to their private council. Sansa drew in a steadying breath. "I understand. I'll remain here then, at least until the situation is more certain. The North needs my hand, my guidance, but I'll send more forces south if you need them. Nian. Asumi." Jon reached out and covered Sansa's hand with his own, a silent thank you for her willingness to stay behind, to manage the seat of House Stark. Arya looked between them, nodding, her resolve unwavering. Before the hush grew too weighty, a gentle rap sounded on the door, and Sir Davos' voice followed. "My lords, my ladies, pardon the interruption. He stepped in, giving each of them a brief nod. "We've received a raven from the Riverlands. A short note, but it's from Lord Edmure Tully himself. He's agreed to meet you along the Red Fork in a fortnight. He's cautious, but open to talks." Arya's eyes lit with renewed purpose. "That's the best news we've had today. We'll need to prepare to ride out." Jon stood, the scrape of his chair on the stone floor, the only sound for a moment. "We will. Let's see what he has to say. If we can secure the Tully's support, that brings us one step closer to having a united front against Cersei." Sansa nodded, relief and vigilance mingling in her expression. "Just be careful. Please." The night wore on, and the hush of the castle fell over them again. In the morning, Jon roused early, determined to see how the new recruits fared. Outside, the pale sky hinted at better weather, but the crisp air still stung. Clutching his cloak around him, he ventured into the training yard. There, a cluster of young soldiers had already assembled, forming two lines facing one another. One line bore shields, the other practiced spears. A senior officer barked orders, drilling them in formations that, while rudimentary, might save their lives in the chaos of real battle. Jon circled the yard, offering quiet words of correction, guiding them on stance and footwork. He couldn't help but recall his time at Castle Black, training with the Night's Watch. He remembered how green recruits, some criminals, some runaways, all novices, eventually learned to fight in formation, to watch each other's backs. In a way, he hoped these men and women would not have to endure half of what he had experienced. But war rarely cared for hopes. Nearby, Podrick Payne sparred with a cluster of Vale Knights, his clumsy beginnings all but forgotten. He moved with an earnest energy, if still not quite polished, but certainly more formidable than he once was. As he ducked a blow, he caught sight of Jon and paused to offer a respectful dip of his head. Jon returned the gesture, remembering how Podrick had served Tyrion so loyally, and now stood among the lines of those committed to the North's cause. Time passed, measured in the clang of steel, the orders shouted across the training ground, and the shuffle of feet on packed earth. When midday came, a grim-faced messenger arrived with news from another corner of the North. A small band of outlaws had taken advantage of the stirring unrest to raid some villages. Jon quietly dispatched more guards and set men to hunt them down. Even now, with the Great War ended, there was no shortage of strife. It only added another worry to the mounting pile. Later, as the sun dipped low, Jon and Arya once again found themselves near the war table in the Great Hall, accompanied by Sansa, Brienne, and a handful of trusted advisors, though no full session was convened. For now, it was a preliminary meeting to decide who would ride to the Riverlands and who would remain behind. Sir Davos offered to accompany them, as did Podrick and a few chosen knights of the Vale. Arya insisted on going, and Jon naturally would lead the diplomatic effort. Sansa would stay behind to protect the North and coordinate with any ravens that arrived, funneling messages to them as quickly as possible. It was a delicate balance, ensuring that Winterfell remained well guarded, while also presenting sufficient strength in negotiations with Edmure Tully. Brienne, too, volunteered to travel south, pledging her sword to keep Arya safe. Arya raised an eyebrow at that, asserting that she could protect herself, but in truth, she appreciated Brienne's offer. She had come to respect the warrior for both her skill and her unwavering sense of honor. With the plan set, they parted ways once more, each with tasks to complete before they set forth. Jon lingered, looking at the weathered map, thinking of the place where they would meet Edmure Tully along the Red Fork. Memories of the last time he traveled the Riverlands seeped into his mind. Days of war, anguish, fleeting hopes. He hoped this journey might be different. The following days in Winterfell saw a flurry of preparation. Horses were shod, wagons packed with provisions and trade goods that might be used to sway uncertain lords. Messengers arrived sporadically with fragments of news. A suspected gathering of Lannister men around Harrenhal, rumors of Sellsword companies massing outside King's Landing, and unconfirmed sightings of gold shipments traveling discreetly through the Reach. Each piece of intelligence fueled the sense that a storm was indeed gathering, and when it broke, all the realm would feel its wrath. Arya took every chance to slip away, to hone her skills in the quiet corners of the castle, or to walk among the soldiers, gauging their spirits. She was neither lord nor lady. She was Arya Stark, a blade forged in adversity. She wanted to stand beside these people, not above them. She asked them about their families, the places they came from, how they fared after the Great War. The stories she heard, from harrowing tales of survival to cautious optimism for the future, steeled her determination that Cersei's tyranny would not stand unchallenged. Meanwhile, Jon prayed in the godswood, kneeling before the ancient weirwood tree, whose face was carved with sorrowful eyes. The leaves rustled overhead, a sound like hushed voices. He closed his eyes, not quite sure to whom he prayed. Perhaps the old gods, perhaps the memory of those he had lost. He thought of Ned Stark, the man he called father for so many years, whose honor had shaped him. He thought of the unwavering courage Ned had shown, and how it ultimately cost him his life. Would Jon be forced to pay the same price? And if so, was that a price he was willing to give? The coldness of the ground seeped through his breeches, and the breath he exhaled condensed in the chilly air. He lingered a while, as if in silent conversation with the tree, letting his doubts and hopes intermingle. When at last he rose, he felt a grim acceptance of what had to be done. There were some paths one could not turn back from, and he had chosen his. The day came at last for them to depart Winterfell. It was a modest procession compared to the armies that had once marched on these grounds. They did not want to draw too much attention as they traveled south, preferring speed and the ability to move lightly should trouble arise. Jon, Arya, Ser Davos, Brienne, Podrick, and a score of guards and servants to manage the supplies. Their cloaks bore the direwolf sigil, though they knew full well that traveling as Starks would garner both respect and enemies. Sansa stood on the steps of Winterfell to see them off. The morning sunlight cast the snow-dusted courtyard in a bright, reflective glow. She hugged Arya tightly, whispered words of caution in her ear, then turned to Jon. In her eyes he saw a swirl of emotion, a sister's worry, a ruler's responsibility, and a quiet confidence that they would do what was right. "Bring them home safe," she murmured. Jon managed a faint smile. "We will." With that, they rode out, their horses snorting plumes of warm breath into the cold air. The gates yawned open, and once they passed, the rolling expanse of the north stretched before them. Every hoofbeat carried them closer to the Riverlands, closer to the uncertain negotiations with Edmure Tully, and closer to the confrontation with Cersei that seemed inevitable. The journey began quietly, the only sounds being the crunch of frozen ground under their mounts and the whisper of wind through the trees. For a while, no one spoke. A serenity clung to the open road, belying the tension that churned in each of their chests. Now and again, Jon would glance at Arya, remembering her once as a small girl with a fierce spirit. He could still see that girl in her, but it had been shaped by countless trials. She would never be the same child who left Winterfell so long ago. Nor would he be the same boy who knew nothing of war or kingship. As the day wore on, they followed the King's Road south, though it was pocked with signs of previous battles. Burned farms, abandoned homes, broken timbers where once stood proud stables or barns. The realm's scars, still fresh, reminded them of the cost of war. No one lingered in such places. The fear of roving bandits or stray remnants of enemy forces had driven people to take shelter elsewhere. When they paused to water their horses and let the animals rest, Ser Davos remarked, "I remember traveling this road to parley with Stannis, then to fight the Boltons. Seems like every path in Westeros has seen bloodshed. Let's hope we can do better this time." Arya's gaze wandered to a dilapidated tavern in the distance, its signs swinging in the breeze. She recalled, distantly, passing a tavern as a girl with a hound. But she had been too consumed by anger and survival to truly notice. Now, she felt the weight of how war changed everything. Yet inside her, there was also a small flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, by toppling Cersei's cruelty, they could rebuild something worthwhile. They carried on. At night they made camp in the shelter of copse or ruin, posting guards in shifts. The moan of the wind through the trees mingled with the crackle of their campfires. Jon and Davos pored over small updates from any couriers they crossed, or from travelers seeking safer roads, gleaning what scraps of news they could. Brienne drilled with Podrick by firelight, their blades clanging as they practiced in the gloom. Arya often took the last watch, slipping away from the fire's glow to pace the perimeter. She would listen to the night, to the faint rustling of animals in the underbrush, or the distant hoot of an owl. Her senses stayed keen, sharpened by the knowledge that an assassin could lurk in any shadow. She never forgot the feel of a blade hidden in the dark, nor the silence of a knife's approach. In the mornings, they pressed on with the same routine, forging ever closer to the riverlands. The land slowly shifted from the rocky terrain of the north to flatter plains and rolling hills. Streams trickled through the softening earth, and the air grew a bit milder. Now and then they'd spot small farmsteads, some abandoned, some with plumes of smoke rising from a single chimney, a sign that, despite everything, life carried on. Jon felt a growing tension within him. This was only the beginning, and already it weighed heavily. He suspected that the real tests would come once they tried to rally the Riverlords, once they tested Gendry Baratheon's allegiance, and eventually, once they made their move against Cersei Lannister. Would the realm unite once more, or would old feuds and new fears tear it apart? Sir Davos saw that tension and spoke to him one late afternoon as they rode side by side. "You look troubled, lad," he said. "I know you didn't want another war. None of us did." Jon gave a curt nod. "We do what we must. But yes, it weighs on me." "Edmonds." Davos cast a glance around, taking in the quiet fields. "We can only do our best. The people deserve a chance at peace. Cersei won't give it to them, so we have to act. Don't let the weight of this break you." Jon gazed ahead, where Arya was riding a few paces in front, her cloak snapping in the wind. Beyond her, Brienne's armor glinted in the daylight. "I won't," Jon murmured. "I've carried heavier burdens before." They rode until twilight spread across the sky in orange and pink brushstrokes, finally stopping for the night near a gentle bend in the Trident's tributaries. The water reflected the dusky sky, and the air carried a hint of moisture. Small tents were erected, and the horses were fed and watered. A hush fell as each of them tended to their tasks, mindful that they were closer now to Tully lands. Tomorrow or the next day, they would reach the agreed-upon meeting spot. Jon stood by the riverbank, watching the water flow, the last light of day illuminating the ripples with a subdued glow. Arya approached, her steps light on the grass, until she stood beside him. For a moment, they watched the current in silence. "How many times have we done this now?" she asked in a quiet voice. Jon's brow furrowed. "I've lost count. Too many. But we keep going." She nodded, a slight determined tilt of her head. "For our family, and for everyone who can't fight for themselves. For those who died, so that others could live." "Dandiwi." Jon's gaze flickered toward her, and he felt a strange mix of sorrow and pride. "Yes," he said, just that single word, carrying more meaning than he could express. Arya reached into her cloak and drew out a small skin of water, taking a sip before offering it to him. The evening breeze caressed them both, and in that brief instance, they felt like the siblings they were. Two children of House Stark, sharing a moment of calm before the storms of war crashed down. They didn't know when they would see Winterfell again, or what shape the realm would take if they succeeded in unseating Cersei. But they both knew they would face whatever came, side by side, loyal to each other, and to the memory of their family. The night deepened. The stars emerged in the vault of the sky, and the quiet lapping of the river against the shore formed a lullaby of sorts, offering a semblance of peace before the next march, the next council, and the next battle. Tomorrow would bring them closer to Edmure Tully, closer to forging alliances, and closer to the war that beckoned from the south. For now, they allowed themselves a moment's rest, hearts steady, blades sharpened, and minds set upon the trials yet to come. Ka. The morning arrived with pale sunlight, filtering through a thin veil of mist rising off the river. Dawn was hushed, with only the distant call of waterfowl echoing across the marshy banks. Jon Snow stirred from a light sleep and emerged from his tent to find the small encampment already awake. Horses stamped at the ground, steam puffing from their nostrils in the crisp air, while the men and women of their party busied themselves with breakfast and packing. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes scanning the unfamiliar landscape. They were still within the Riverlands, though not yet close enough to the Red Fork to meet Edmure Tully that day. From memory, John estimated they needed at least another half-day's ride, and even then, they would want to set up a decent campsite on the outskirts of the meeting point before approaching Edmure's envoys. War had taught John caution. Never ride blindly into a negotiation without first securing the lay of the land. Arya stood near the water's edge, her cloak stirring in the faint breeze. She watched small ripples, lapping the river stones, the early sun casting sharp reflections across her face. John joined her, each footstep crunching on damp gravel. She sensed him before he spoke, turning her head slightly in acknowledgement. "You slept at all?" he asked gently. She shrugged. "Some. I was on the late watch." He nodded, appreciating her vigilance. The nights had been uneventful so far, but that didn't mean they would remain so. Bands of lawless men still prowled these lands, drawn by desperation or sheer cruelty. They had to stay on guard. Arya's gaze flicked upstream, her expression unreadable. "I was thinking about what we're going to say to Edmure. I've never been close to him. To me, he was just our mother's brother who always seemed uncertain. The last time we all crossed paths, it was under such difficult circumstances." "He's been through a great deal," John said quietly. "He was a prisoner of the Freys for years, lost much of his family, and watched his homeland torn apart. He'll be cautious." She nodded, a slight movement. "He'll also want reassurances that we can truly face Cersei if it comes to war." "We'll offer him what we can," John replied. "His men, his knowledge of the Riverlands will be vital. We need safe passage, supply lines. He needs to know we're not dragging him into a hopeless fight." Arya's fingers brushed against the hilt of needle, a habit she'd carried from her earliest days of training. "Let's just hope we can win him over with words and not force. We don't need more enemies." They stood in silence a moment, breathing in the crisp morning air. Birds flitted in the reeds, and somewhere behind them, Podrick could be heard coaxing the horses with quiet, reassuring words. Eventually, John placed a hand lightly on Arya's shoulder and motioned back toward the makeshift camp. Their company would soon be ready to depart. The day's journey needed to start early if they hoped to reach the rendezvous before nightfall. Sir Davos, rubbing his hands together for warmth, was supervising the packing of supplies. His face brightened when he spotted John and Arya returning from the riverbank. "We're nearly ready, my lord," he said in that understated gravelly voice. "The horses have been fed, and the tents are down. One or two of the men want to check the route ahead. Shall we send them forward?" John agreed. "Yes. Have them ride a mile or two ahead. Tell them to keep their eyes open for any sign of trouble. Lannister scouts, bandits, whoever might be lurking. We can't be too careful." "That's Duine." Davos inclined his head, stepping away to relay the instructions. Brienne of Tarth adjusted the buckles on her chestplate, the polished metal glinting in the morning light. She'd been traveling in partial armor for comfort, but as they drew closer to Edmure's domain, she wanted to be prepared for any encounter. Podrick hovered nearby, juggling the last of their rations into a cloth sack, while also readying his own gear. "It feels different here," Podrick remarked quietly, glancing around at the greenery and the gently rolling landscape. "It's less bleak, isn't it?" Brienne responded with a thoughtful look. "Aye. But the Riverlands have suffered too in their own way. Death just leaves different scars here." Podrick's eyes flickered with sympathy, remembering the stories of the Red Wedding, the sacking of River Run, the betrayals that had carved blood into the heart of these lands. He finished tying off the sack and hefted it onto one of the supply horses, making sure it was secure. Before long, the group was mounted and moving. The path they followed ran parallel to the river for a while, then meandered through meadows, where tall grass brushed the horses' flanks. Despite the potential dangers, there was a peaceful quality to the morning. The sky was a pale, cloud-strewn blue, and a soft breeze carried hints of wildflowers and damp earth. Arya took the lead for a stretch, scanning the horizon with keen eyes. She noted small changes in the landscape. scratches on tree bark that might indicate passing travelers, ruts in the earth hinting at wagon wheels, the subdued hush of a place still healing from war. Occasionally, she or Brienne would ride ahead to crest a small rise and keep watch. They saw no immediate threats, just a lonely expanse of farmland where farmers were scarce, if present at all. By midday, they halted to water the horses near a shallow, winding creek. The scouts who'd gone ahead returned, reporting no sign of large armies or Lannister patrols. Still, they'd spotted a handful of travelers, merchants by the look of it, heading west, perhaps toward Seaguard or Fairmarket. None seemed openly hostile. Jon dismounted, stretching his shoulders. "Let's eat something quickly," he suggested to Davos. "Then we'll push on." Davos nodded, rummaging through packs to produce some dried meat and a few hard biscuits. Podrick poured water into a wooden cup for Brienne, who drank deeply. Travel in armor, even partial armor, was taxing, and the day had grown warmer than expected for early spring. As they ate, Arya noticed something on the horizon, 3 small figures on horseback, kicking up a faint trail of dust. She tensed and pointed. "Riders," she said simply, her tone alert. Brienne and Jon both turned, each shading their eyes with a hand against the sunlight. The riders seemed to be heading in their direction, though it was too far to tell if it was coincidence or intent. Jon cast a quick glance toward the others. "Everyone, keep your guard up," he said under his breath. "But let's not draw swords unless we must." The group quietly resumed their saddles. The riders came closer, soon visible as men in plain clothing without any obvious sigils. One held a spear across his lap, but it wasn't raised. Another had a short bow, slung around his back. By the time they came within speaking distance, Jon moved forward slightly, holding up a hand. "Greetings," he called out in a steady voice. "State your business." The trio reined in their horses. One of them, a lean, middle-aged man with lines of weariness etched into his face, raised his empty hand in a sign of peace. "We mean no harm," he said, his accent marking him as a local. "We saw your party and figured you might be soldiers. We're from a nearby village, or what's left of it. We've been patrolling, trying to keep out bandits." Jon relaxed marginally but did not lower his guard completely. "We're not bandits," he said. "We're travelers on our way south." The man nodded, looking relieved. The others shifted in their saddles, exchanging glances. One of them, younger and with a faded scar on his cheek, ventured to ask, "Are you with Lord Tully?" Jon hesitated. The question was loaded. Revealing too much might incite suspicion or conversation beyond what they wanted. But lying outright was risky too, especially if these men were loyal to Edmure or to the Riverlands. Arya spoke up, her voice calm. "We have business with him." The men exchanged another quick look. The older man exhaled, rubbing a hand across the stubble on his chin. "If you're heading for Lord Edmure, we can at least tell you there's been trouble in these parts. A few bands of outlaws roam the roads, shaking down travelers or worse. Be careful." Ser Davos nodded from behind Jon. "We appreciate the warning." The man and his companions seemed satisfied that Jon's group posed no threat, for they began to turn their horses aside. "If you go 3 miles more, you'll come to a split in the road by an old oak. Take the left fork if you mean to keep heading toward River Run. The right leads back into the hills, where rumors say there's a den of thieves." Brienne thanked them, and the 3 villagers trotted off, continuing their makeshift patrol. Jon and Arya exchanged a glance, each pondering the mention of outlaws. It was hardly surprising. Chaos bred opportunists, and the Riverlands had seen more than its share of chaos. They continued, forging on through the afternoon, passing by copses of trees and low-rolling hills. The wide skies above gradually shifted from bright midday to the richer hues of later afternoon. The subtle exhaustion of the journey weighed on them, but no one complained. Their purpose pulled them onward. As the sun began its slow descent, the land dipped into a shallow valley, and the red fork of the Trident came into view. The water glimmered in the angled light, and Jon felt a faint tug of memory. Stories of Robb Stark's campaigns, of battles fought in these very fields. He glanced at Arya, wondering if she too felt the ghosts that lingered here. They reached a place where an old wooden signpost stood, battered by weather and war. Much of the paint was chipped away, but faint lettering indicated that River Run lay a few miles downstream. John recognized the area as roughly the spot where Edmure had agreed to meet. They needed to find a secure patch of land to set their camp. Brienne, Podrick, and a couple of guards rode ahead, circling to inspect the terrain. Soon enough, they returned and led the group to a gentle slope leading down to the river, partially screened by a stand of willows. It would provide modest cover from prying eyes, but not so much that they'd be easily ambushed. They dismounted, the horses nickering softly. John ordered half the men to set up a perimeter while the others pitched tents. Arya joined the perimeter detail, scouting along the tree line, scanning for any suspicious movement. She found none besides the rustle of small woodland creatures. Sir Davos busied himself with organizing supplies, enough for the next few days at least, while Brienne, always methodical, began checking weapons. Podrick tried to help, stumbling a bit over a heavy crate, but managing to get it where it needed to be. The quiet hustle of camp building filled the air, mingling with the soft rush of the river. John watched the men raise a couple of tents with practiced efficiency. A pang of memory nudged him. So many camps over the years, from the cramped tents of the knights watched to the war camps of the Stark forces. Each one brought its own sense of trepidation and hope. Tonight was no different. When night settled over them, they lit only a few torches and kept the fires small, not wanting to draw too much attention. The moon rose behind a drift of thin clouds, bathing the campsite in silver. Guards rotated watch in pairs, each patrolling the perimeter quietly. John and Arya conferred with Sir Davos, Brienne, and a few trusted Stark guards. They planned how to approach the meeting with Edmure come dawn or midday, whenever the Tully contingent arrived. They would present themselves with courtesy, but also a certain confidence. They had come a long way, and they did not intend to be turned away easily. Davos, looking thoughtful, said, "Hell want to know what exactly we hope to achieve. It's not just about dethroning Cersei, though that's part of it. It's about what kind of realm we want afterward. Lord Tully's not a man who leaps blindly into conflict. He'll be thinking of his people first." Arya murmured, "He should. That's what a lord is supposed to do." Brienne agreed quietly. "He'll also want to ensure that his men won't be used as fodder in some ill-conceived campaign. We need to show him we have a plan, or at least the beginnings of one." "Manishen." John nodded, his expression grim. "We do have a plan, or the start of one. We rally the Riverlands, secure the north, then make contact with the Stormlands. If Gendry sides with us, that's another wedge against King's Landing. We can circle the Crown lands from multiple directions, forcing Cersei to split her forces." A hush settled as the group reflected on the scale of what lay ahead. War was not something any of them wanted, but it seemed inevitable. Eventually, they parted, each retreating to a tent or to a place near the campfire. The watch was set, and the night stretched on. John tried to sleep, but his mind churned with images of possibility. The banners of House Stark, Tully and Baratheon marching together, and the golden lion of House Lannister bearing its claws in response. He drifted into uneasy dreams, filled with flickers of past battles, Hardhome, Winterfell, the echoes of steel and the chill of death. When he awoke, it was to the gentle sound of the river and the smell of bread warming over a fire. Dawn had come, painting the eastern sky in pale oranges and pinks. Arya was already up, quietly speaking to one of the guards who had stood watch. She caught John's eye and nodded in greeting. Around them, the camp was stirring. Some members of their party rolled up blankets, others inspected the horses for the day ahead. A subdued tension filled the air. They knew this day would bring them face to face with Edmure, or at least his representatives. Not an hour later, a horn sounded from across the river. It was a low, echoing note, carrying over the water. Immediately, the entire camp went on alert. John and Arya exchanged glances, then signaled for their men to hold position. From between tall reeds on the far bank, a small boat emerged, rowed by two men wearing the Tully Trout sigil on their tunics. At the prow stood a knight, also clad in Tully colors, holding up one hand in greeting. They did not appear hostile, but they were armed. Jon stepped forward to the edge of the water, while Arya and Brienne flanked him. Sir Davos and a few guards remained just behind, watchful. The boat scraped gently against the pebbled shore, and the knight disembarked, water lapping around his boots. "Which of you is Jon Snow?" he asked, his tone polite but guarded. Jon inclined his head. "I am." The knight's gaze swept over Arya and Brienne, then back to Jon. "Lord Edmure Tully sends his greetings, along with an invitation to speak with him at a nearby holdfast. He awaits your presence and wishes for peaceful talks." Arya's voice was cool, measured. "We accept. We mean no harm to Lord Tully or the Riverlands, we merely seek his counsel." The knight gave a tight nod. "You may bring a small retinue, no more than a dozen. We'll ferry you across and escort you to him." Jon glanced at Arya, Brienne, and Davos. That was fewer than he might have hoped, but standard for a cautious negotiation. "We understand," Jon said. "We'll gather those who will come and leave the rest in camp." They stepped away to confer in low voices. Jon decided that he, Arya, Brienne, Davos, Podrick, and 6 guards would be enough. The others would remain behind to guard the camp. Satisfied with that arrangement, they returned to the boat. In small groups, they were ferried across the Red Fork, the oars creaking against the current. Once on the other side, they mounted horses provided by the Tully contingent. The knight introduced himself as Sir Robin Longfield, a seasoned retainer of House Tully. He led them along a narrow path that wound through the willows and followed the gentle bend of the river. The morning air was fresh, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and the hum of insects stirring along the bank. The company rode in a tense silence. Tully soldiers mixed in with Jon's men. They appeared well disciplined, though not in great number. Jon suspected that Edmure had hidden many of his forces nearby, prepared to react if the meeting went sour. He couldn't blame the man. Caution was wise in these times. After half an hour, they reached a small stone holdfast, perched on a slight rise above the river. It wasn't River Run itself, likely an old outpost, used now for official gatherings or as a fallback position in uncertain times. A wooden gate stood open, flanked by more guards in Tully colors. They eyed the newcomers warily, but allowed them entry once Sir Robin signaled. The courtyard inside was modest, with a single tower rising from the rear. Straw scattered underfoot, and a few chickens pecked at the ground near a stable. Jon dismounted, as did Arya and the others. Sir Robin gestured for them to follow him into the tower's main hall. Inside, the space was dimly lit by narrow windows. A large wooden table occupied the center, bearing a pitcher of water, a few cups, and a loaf of bread. Seated at the head of the table was Edmure Tully. He looked older than Jon remembered, his hair grayer and the lines of worry etched deeper into his brow. He wore a simple tunic and a cloak of rich blue cloth, pinned with a trout sigil. The years of captivity and hardship showed, but there was still a certain dignity in his bearing. He rose as they approached, and for a moment, his eyes lingered on Arya. There was a flicker of recognition, along with the faint sadness of recalling how little he truly knew of his nieces and nephews. "Jon Snow," he said, turning his gaze to Jon. "I welcome you in the name of House Tully. And Arya Stark. I'd heard rumors you were back in Westeros." His voice wavered slightly, as if unsure whether to sound grateful or mournful at all that had transpired. Arya's expression softened, just a fraction. "I'm here, uncle," she said. "We come seeking alliance, or at least understanding." Edmure inclined his head slowly. "So I've been told." He motioned to the benches around the table. "Sit. Let us speak plainly. I'd offer a grander welcome, but times are uncertain, and caution is prudent." They sat, while Sir Robin and a handful of Tully guards stood along the walls. Brienne, Podrick, Davos, and the 6 Stark guards spread out, remaining attentive. Jon noted how Edmure's men looked alert, ready for any sign of danger, yet not overtly threatening. It reminded him of how quickly trust could collapse if one misstep was taken. Edmure folded his hands on the table. "I have received your raven, and I understand you believe another war is coming. You want the Riverlands to join the cause against Queen Cersei." Jon nodded once. "That's correct. We don't seek war lightly, But we can't stand by while she tightens her grip on the realm through fear and treachery. We believe the North, the Vale, and possibly the Stormlands will stand together. But we need the Riverlands. Edmure's jaw tightened at the mention of Cersei's name. He'd suffered personally from the fallout of her schemes. Still, the weight of leadership was heavy on him. The Riverlands have been the battleground for too long, he said quietly. We've endured the War of the Five Kings, the atrocities at the Twins, the occupation of River Run, by Lannisters and Freys. My people are weary. They want to rebuild their farms, feed their families. Many have no stomach for another war. Arya leaned forward slightly. We understand their suffering. We know the cost. But Cersei won't leave the Riverlands in peace forever. Once she secures her power in the south, she'll look to the rest of Westeros. She's proven she can't be trusted to keep any agreement. Edmure's eyes flicked to Arya, a hint of sorrow in them. You speak with such certainty, child. But yes, I know the measure of Cersei. She's no friend to the Tullys. And yet, I must consider what another rebellion would bring. Are your forces truly strong enough to challenge the Iron Throne? I've heard the North is depleted from the Great War, and there are rumors that the Golden Company still serves Cersei in King's Landing. Nice. Jon exhaled, folding his hands on the table. Our numbers aren't what they once were, that's true. But the North stands united, and the Vale remains an ally thanks to Sansa Stark's relationship with Lord Royce. We're also reaching out to Gendry Baratheon in the Stormlands. He has reason to oppose Cersei, and reason to support us. Edmure's brow rose. Gendry Baratheon? The bastard blacksmith rumored to be Robert's son. He's Lord of Storm's End now, isn't he? They? Arya gave a small nod. Yes. He was legitimized and granted the castle. I know him. He's a good man. I believe he'll join us if he sees the North and the Riverlands are allied. Edmure's gaze roamed the table, absorbing their words. The torches along the walls flickered, lending the scene a wavering glow. At last he leaned back in his chair, expression measured. What would you have me do, he asked. Provide soldiers, provisions? March on King's Landing? The Riverlands have lost much. Men, resources, the will to fight. We're barely beginning to recover. If I commit my forces, I risk my people's lives and livelihood once again. Enogan shall. Davos spoke up gently. My lord, we don't ask you to throw away the lives of your folk on a whim. We ask for an alliance that can prevent a worse fate. A realm under Cersei's heel is no realm at all. She'll bleed it dry as her father did, as her children might after her, if she has any. If you join us, we'll share resources and intelligence. Together, we'll plan a strategy that aims to spare as many lives as possible. Minister Shandi. Edmure looked at Davos. Recognition flickered across his face, though it was clear he wasn't intimately familiar with the man's history. Still, Davos carried an air of seasoned honesty that was hard to ignore. Brienne cleared her throat. Lord Tully, I served Lady Catelyn Stark once, as you may remember. She was a good woman who always sought to protect her family and the Riverlands. I believe if she were here, she'd see that this alliance is the best chance to free the realm from tyranny. But it's your choice to make. A momentary sadness passed over Edmure's features at the mention of Catelyn. He had lost a sister, among so many others. I remember, he said softly. She told me once that knights are meant to protect the innocent, not just serve the whims of kings and lords. I wish she were here to guide me now. He paused, then rubbed his temple. Let me be frank. Riverrun can rally perhaps 3,000 men at present, scattered across the Riverlands. There are more, but it would take time to gather them. Time and a show of confidence that this cause isn't doomed. Jon leaned forward. We're not doomed. We're not rushing into this blindly. We intend to gather allies, plan carefully, and strike only when the moment is right. If you join us, you'll have a seat at that council. You'll have a say in how we proceed. We're not looking to drag you along behind us. We want a true partnership. Edmure tapped his fingers on the table, staring at the wood grain as though searching for answers there. At length, He lifted his gaze. Then you propose we form a war council soon. One that includes the North, the Vale, and whoever else we can muster. Arya confirmed with a short nod. Yes. If we can meet in a secure location and gather the lords loyal to our cause, we can finalize a plan. We'd like you at that table. He released a long breath, shoulders visibly sagging with the weight of the decision. I can't promise you men tonight or tomorrow, but I can promise that I'll hear you out. I'll listen to whatever plan you devise, and if I judge it to have a real chance of success, I'll pledge my banner. But I want security for my people. Promises that the Riverlands won't be left to face the Lannisters alone if things go poorly. Manor. Jon nodded resolutely. You have that promise. We don't abandon our allies. Edmure regarded him closely for a moment, perhaps gauging the sincerity in his dark eyes. Then he gave a small, firm nod. Very well. Let us consider this an understanding, if not a final pledge. Allow me some days to gather my bannermen to speak with them. Then we can reconvene, perhaps at River Run itself. It's more defensible, and we can accommodate more guests. Arya and Jon exchanged a look, each feeling a guarded sense of relief. This was progress, if only the first tenuous step. War was not won in a day, and alliances were never formed without risk. But at least Edmure Tully had opened the door. Davos asked quietly, "How soon can you gather them? We mean to send word to Storm's End in the meantime." "Give me a fortnight," Edmure said. "Some of my bannermen are scattered. I'll send ravens. After that, we'll meet at River Run. You'll have my hospitality, what little I can offer." "Bani." Brienne inclined her head. "Thank you, my lord. We'll respect your timeline." Edmure glanced around the hall, then signaled to a guard who brought forth a small jug of wine and cups. Edmure poured for them all himself, a gesture of politeness and a hint of old courtesy that had not died in him. He handed the first cup to Jon, then Arya, then to Davos and Brienne before taking one for himself. He raised his cup, though it wobbled slightly in his grip. "To the memory of family," he said, voice tight with emotion, "and to forging a future where our children need not bear the wars of their parents." Jon swallowed hard, lifting his cup in return. Arya did the same, though her expression carried the ghost of old wounds. They drank quietly, letting the wine's warmth settle their nerves. When the cups were empty, Edmure signaled that the meeting was over. He promised safe conduct back to the river crossing, and the assurance of no hostility in this region, so long as negotiations continued. Jon thanked him, feeling the weight of the day. It was not a triumphant victory, but a necessary piece of the puzzle now in place. Outside, the sun was high, and the courtyard bright with midday light. Jon and the others remounted their borrowed horses, accompanied again by Sir Robin and a small squad of Tully men. As they trotted out of the holdfast, Jon reflected on how precarious alliances could be. Edmure had committed to nothing permanent yet, only a willingness to listen. But that was more than they had yesterday. Arya rode alongside Brienne, each lost in her own thoughts. Behind them, Davos and Podrick exchanged quiet remarks. The men from Winterfell's guard remained disciplined, saying little but keeping watchful eyes on the surroundings. At the river, they parted ways amicably. Sir Robin supervised the crossing, and then, with a respectful bow, he and his men withdrew into the willows, disappearing into the green hush. Jon stood on the pebbled bank for a moment, watching them go, pondering what would happen in 2 weeks when they reconvened at River Run. His own men in the camp greeted their return with cautious optimism. Arya reported what transpired to those who had stayed behind, explaining that Edmure was at least open to forming an alliance. The atmosphere in the camp shifted, relief mingling with the perpetual tension of what might come next. Jon and Sir Davos retreated to the command tent to discuss their next moves. Within the tent, the light was dim, filtered through the canvas, and the air smelled faintly of old leather and lantern oil. Arya joined them, along with Brienne, Podrick, and a few senior guards. "We have a fortnight before the meeting at River Run," Jon began, resting his hands on the edge of a rough wooden table. "In that time, we should seek more information. We need to know if Cersei has made any moves toward the Riverlands, or if she's focusing on the Crown lands. We also need to confirm whether Gendry Baratheon has responded to our raven. Davos, leaning with one hand on his hip, nodded. We could use those 2 weeks to return to Winterfell, but that might waste valuable time traveling back and forth. Instead, we might establish a temporary base at a more central location. Maybe in the outskirts of Moat Cailin, or even in the Riverlands themselves. No, Father. Arya tapped her fingers on the table's surface. We could also send more scouts further south, closer to the Crownlands, to gather intelligence. If we rely only on Tully's eyes, we might miss something. Brienne spoke up, her voice measured. There's also the question of re-establishing contact with the Vale. Has Sansa sent any new ravens updating us on Lord Royce's stance? Jon considered this. We expected a raven from Winterfell in the next few days. If Sansa has news, we'll know soon enough. For now, let's not stray too far from Riverrun, or we risk missing our meeting. Perhaps we can find a secure spot a few hours' ride away and make camp there. That would allow us to send scouts in multiple directions. Podrick piped up. My lord, there's an old crossroads inn not far from here, though I'm not sure of its current state. It might be a decent base of operations if it's still standing and not overrun by brigands. Arya's eyes flicked to Podrick. She recalled more than one crossroads inn in these parts, and trouble often found them. But it was still better than being in the open. It's worth a look, she said. The plan formed. They would move their camp a bit further south, toward the area near the crossroads. From there, they could dispatch small scouting parties to glean more about Lannister movements, and also be within a day or two's ride of Riverrun for the upcoming council. Once the council was done, they could decide whether to return north or to push further south to meet potential allies in the Stormlands. That evening, they began packing up, not wanting to linger on the riverbank any longer than necessary. The men worked under the late afternoon sun, taking down tents and loading wagons. Soon, they were ready to move. Though the day was already half spent, Jon decided they would ride until dusk, then make a temporary camp on the road, finishing the journey the next day. By the time they set off, the sky was streaked with fiery hues, and the breeze carried the fresh scent of riverside reeds. Their column stretched across the winding path, horses clopping in rhythmic strides. Brienne and Podrick rode near the front, keeping an eye out for trouble. Arya ranged off to the side now and then, scouting vantage points on small rises, her keen eyes missing little. Jon stayed central, periodically sending a rider to the back or front with instructions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they found a reasonable clearing near a cluster of ash trees, with enough space for tents and a few campfires. The perimeter was quickly established. They tethered the horses and set about erecting smaller tents for a brief stay. Once the fires flickered to life, Arya wandered around the camp's edge, restlessly scanning the darkening tree line. Eventually, she caught sight of Brienne, who was standing alone, gazing at the sky. Arya approached, footsteps quiet. Brienne turned her head, offering a faint smile. You move almost like a shadow, Arya. I barely heard you. Arya shrugged. Old habits. She paused, letting the crackle of a nearby fire fill the silence. Then she said, Thank you for speaking up in front of Edmure. Mentioning my mother, it helped, I think. Brienne lowered her gaze for a moment. I only spoke the truth. Your mother was a formidable woman, wise in ways that many men never understood. If she were here, I believe we'd be standing on the same side, fighting the same battle for the good of the realm. Arya nodded, a distant look in her eyes. I wish she was. Then, as if catching herself before she sank too deeply into sorrow, she squared her shoulders. We'll honor her memory by doing what's right. Brienne's expression was solemn. Indeed, we should all remember those we've lost, so we don't repeat the mistakes that cost their lives. Then, a gentle hush settled between them. Arya, ever guarded with her emotions, gave a small nod and slipped away into the camp's bustle. Brienne watched her for a moment, a mixture of respect and concern in her gaze, then turned her attention back to the night sky. Later, a modest supper was shared. It was not a feast, but bread, salted beef, and some root vegetables cooked in a thin broth. The conversation around the fires was subdued, focusing on mundane concerns. The state of the horses' hooves, the watch rotations for the night, the possibility of finding fresh game along the road. War hovered in everyone's minds, but for a brief time, they allowed themselves the simplicity of practical matters. Jon found a moment to sit with Sir Davos near one of the fires. The old knight sipped from a wooden cup, occasionally rubbing at the stump of his missing fingertips, a habit he sometimes fell into when lost in thought. "You think Edmure will truly join us?" Jon asked, speaking quietly so as not to be overheard by too many. "Or is he just placating us until he can decide what best serves him?" Davos gave a low chuckle. "Oh, he'll think of what best serves him, sure enough. All lords do. But Edmure's not a bad man. He cares for his people, and he bears no love for the Lannisters. My guess is that if we can show him a real chance of success, he'll stand with us. But if our cause seems fragile, if there's any sign we might lose, he'll hesitate." Jon couldn't fault Edmure for that logic, as bitter as it felt. Too many had died in the Riverlands for hollow promises or reckless campaigns. Edmure owed it to his people to be certain. "We just have to make sure our cause isn't fragile then," Jon murmured. "We need Gendry. If the Baratheon name carries weight, it might inspire some confidence." Davos nodded in agreement. "And the Vale, and the North. If they all unite, it's a formidable alliance. Cersei would find it hard to crush us without splitting her focus. And we both know what can happen when an enemy splits their focus." Mimnimd. A flicker of old memory passed between them. Battles won and lost through cunning strategy. The difference between a single decisive move and a reckless gamble. Jon clapped Davos on the shoulder gratefully and stood, scanning the faces gathered around the fire. He saw grit, exhaustion, and that stubborn determination he had come to rely on. At least he was not alone in the struggle. The night wore on, and watch rotations relieved those who needed rest. Arya took a shift, as she often did. Jon retired to a small tent, lying awake for some time before sleep finally claimed him. He dreamt of a stag running through a dark forest, pursued by a golden lion, and watched from the shadows by a gray direwolf. The dream faded into the swirling shapes and colors of half-formed fears, until he woke in the gray pre-dawn, heart pounding. They broke camp quickly at first light, heading south again. The terrain shifted from riverbanks to gentle plains, dotted with the remains of old farmhouses. Here and there, the stone foundations of barns jutted up like broken teeth, blackened by fire. Moss and vines crept over half-collapsed walls. It was a stark reminder of how thoroughly the Riverlands had been ravaged. Over the course of the morning they encountered a few scattered travelers, an old couple coaxing a donkey cart, a pair of peddlers leading ponies laden with cheap goods, a family traveling on foot with all their possessions in rickety handcarts. In each case, Jon's party questioned them politely, offering some measure of reassurance where they could. Most were suspicious at first, but relaxed when they recognized the stark banner, or saw the courtesy extended. One middle-aged peddler, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, told them of hearing rumors about Lannister soldiers marching eastward from the Crownlands. She had no first-hand proof, but the talk alone raised concern. Jon listened carefully, though such rumors could swirl from anything. Still, he made a mental note to dispatch scouts in that direction as soon as they had a stable base. By midday, they reached the place Podrick had mentioned. It was indeed an old crossroads, though the inn was little more than a scorched ruin. No roof remained, and the walls were partially collapsed. Weeds and thistles thrived in the cracks of the foundation. Arya eyed the sight with a faint grimace, recalling a time she'd passed an inn near these parts, though it might not have been this exact one. So many roadside taverns had been looted or burned during the wars. They dismounted to explore, picking their way among the charred timbers. It was clear that no one had inhabited the site for a long while. A half-toppled sign still creaked in the breeze, though the painted words were illegible. The once hardy stables were reduced to rubble. A sense of bleakness clung to the place. Podrick sighed. I suppose it was too much to hope it'd still be intact. Davos scratched at his beard. We might at least clear some of the area, use the old walls for partial shelter. It's better than nothing, and the crossroads give us quick routes north or west if we need them. Jon nodded, though he felt little enthusiasm at making a base in this ruin. Still, it was indeed near the roads that branched off toward the Vale and the Crown Lands. It was a strategic spot. "All right," he said. "We'll set up here for now. Let's push back the rubble enough to make room for tents. We'll need to post guards on each road leading in." "Nah, Ninis." Brienne surveyed the distance. "We should also do a quick patrol around the area, ensure we're not walking into a trap. These ruins might hide bandits." Arya promptly volunteered. "I'll go," she said, glancing around at the men. "I'll take 3 with me and circle around." Jon agreed, assigning her a few reliable scouts. While they swept the surroundings, the rest of the group began the process of clearing debris, gathering stray planks for makeshift barricades, and determining a layout for their tents. It wasn't comfortable or pretty, but it would do. Arya and her scouts vanished into the tree line, quietly combing the vicinity. They found little sign of human habitation, just old wagon tracks and animal prints. At one point, they startled a small herd of deer that bolted into deeper woods. Eventually, satisfied no immediate threat lurked nearby, they returned to the inn site. The evening came on swift wings, the sky turning soft lavender as the sun dipped below distant hills. The group ate a meager supper of roasted game one of the hunters had caught. A skinny hare that barely made a morsel for more than a few men, supplemented by stale bread and cheese. Morale remained steady enough, buoyed by the knowledge that Edmure had not rejected them outright. Jon spent some time with the map they'd brought from Winterfell, comparing it to the roads that branched off from the crossroads. Occasionally he exchanged thoughts with Sir Davos about where best to send scouts, how many, and in which directions. The plan emerged that come morning they'd dispatch 2 small teams. One would head east toward Harrenhal, the other southeast to check for any sign of Lannister movement near the Blackwater Rush. They would stay out of sight, ask questions discreetly, then return within a few days to report. Arya listened attentively, leaning over the map. I want to lead one of those teams," she said, voice certain. "I know how to move quietly." Jon studied her for a moment, recalling how she'd survived in hiding, how she'd become an expert at stealth. He knew she was capable. Yet he still hesitated, protective instincts warring with the recognition of her skill. Finally he nodded. "Take 4 men, no more. And be careful. If you see any sign of large forces, you return to us. We're not picking fights alone." She gave a small smile, something akin to gratitude mixed with resolve. "Understood." A hush settled over the camp as night deepened. Guards stood at the perimeter, eyes scanning the darkness. Some men shared quiet conversation around the low fire, but exhaustion soon drove most to their tents. The flicker of distant lightning occasionally illuminated the horizon, suggesting a storm might brew in the coming days. Jon gazed at the ruined walls, thinking of how they mirrored the realm itself, broken, scorched, yet potentially a place to rebuild something stronger. He whispered a short prayer to the old gods, or perhaps to any god listening, for the success of this fragile coalition. Early the next day, Arya departed with her scout team, riding southeast to gather intelligence. She wore practical leathers, bow slung over her shoulder and needle at her hip. The men with her were seasoned enough, though not quite as adept at stealth as she. She made up for that by guiding them on which paths to take, when to dismount and proceed on foot, and how to avoid detection if Lannister patrols roamed the area. Meanwhile, Jon oversaw the departure of the second scouting party, heading east. Brienne remained at the crossroads site to maintain order and security. Davos, Podrick, and a handful of others began building rudimentary barricades from broken beams and any scrap they could find. If trouble arose, at least they'd have some semblance of defense. Days passed in a tense routine. Scouts came and went, bringing scattered news. Sightings of small groups of soldiers wearing the Lannister sigil, rumors of increased traffic on the Roserad. Whispers hinted that the Golden Company was still in King's Landing, but their numbers were uncertain. Some travelers spoke of new taxes being enforced along the Blackwater, presumably to fund Cersei's war chest. Arya had not yet returned, which gnawed at Jon's nerves. He told himself she was resourceful, that she could handle herself, but doubt still crept in at night when he stared at the stars and wondered where she was. Sir Davos tried to reassure him. saying Arya was likely gathering as much intel as possible before returning. On the 5th day since Arya left, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Jon tore open the letter to find Sansa's tidy handwriting. She wrote that Lord Royce remained supportive, though not exuberant. The Vale would likely send some knights, but they too awaited more concrete plans. Sansa mentioned that no word from Gendry Baratheon had yet reached Winterfell, though that might be due to ravens taking different routes, or Gendry being occupied. Jon frowned, wanting some sign that Gendry had received their entreaty. Night fell again, and the camp bustled with subdued energy. A few men tended to a pot of stew. Podrick sharpened his sword by lamplight, humming under his breath. Brienne walked the perimeter, exchanging quiet words with the guards. At the command tent, Jon Davos pored over the map once more, deciding how best to approach the upcoming meeting at River Run, now less than a week away. Suddenly, a stir at the edge of the camp drew Jon's attention. A handful of voices called out, and by the flickering torchlight, he saw Arya's distinctive silhouette riding in. She looked tired but unharmed, her scouts trailing behind her. Jon left the tent, relief rushing through him. Arya dismounted with a briskness that belied her fatigue. Her eyes were sharp as she approached. "We have news," she said simply, gesturing for her men to gather around so they could report together. Jon guided them to the command area, offering Arya a canteen of water. She took a long drink before speaking. "We spotted small clusters of Lannister soldiers near the Stormlands border, likely scouting parties. One group was accompanied by a man wearing the colors of House Sunglass, possibly a minor lord sworn to King's Landing now. We kept our distance, tried to get a head count. Now, and one of her scouts, a lean fellow with a scar on his forehead, continued, they weren't large forces, 50 men at most. But the fact they're so far from the capital suggests they're keeping an eye on who travels in or out of the Stormlands." Arya took over again. "We also heard from a merchant that King's Landing is building up its navy at the Blackwater. More ships under the Lannister banner, plus a rumored alliance with some Cersei captains. It seems Cersei is preparing for a fight on land and sea." Jon's jaw tensed. "That's consistent with what we've heard. She wants to control every approach, from the roads to the bays. It won't be easy to break her hold." Davos let out a low whistle. "Well, that confirms it, doesn't it? She's not sitting idle. She's preparing. By the time we muster a proper force, she may already have her defenses in place." Arya inclined her head, acknowledging the concern. "We still have time if we move wisely. She doesn't know exactly where or when we'll strike, but we have to assume she's trying to lure potential allies away from us with gold, or threats, or both. Then maybe can." Jon exhaled slowly. "We'll have to rely on the alliances we can secure in the next few weeks. The meeting at River Run is crucial. If we can convince Edmure and his bannermen to stand fully with us, we'll have a strong base in the heart of Westeros. Then, hopefully, we get word from Gendry that the Stormlands are in play. After that, we plan how to strike at King's Landing. We'll keep the Vale in the loop, and Sansa will hold the north." "Nay?" Arya shook her head slightly, as though trying to brush away doubt. "We'll need a real battle plan soon. Cersei's not going to wait forever." Jon placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles. "I know," he said softly. "Rest now. You've done well. Your men look exhausted, and so do you." She started to protest, but her fatigue was undeniable. At last, she gave a curt nod and allowed one of the guards to lead her horse away. The scouts murmured thanks and drifted to find food and a place to sleep. Jon and Davos watched them go, the glow of lanterns casting weary faces in amber light. Brienne joined them, having heard the gist of Arya's report. "This meeting with Edmure can't come soon enough," she said quietly. "No," Jon replied, "but we have to be ready when it does. Every piece of information, every bit of planning matters now." That night, the wind picked up, rattling through the skeletal remains of the inn and rustling the tents. A sense of foreboding settled over the camp, as though the realm itself trembled at the tension building beneath its surface. Jon felt it in his bones. An oncoming storm, not just of weather, but of swords and blood, alliances and betrayals. He went to the edge of camp, gazing out at the darkness that spread across the crossroads. The future lay in shadows, uncertain but inevitable. In less than a week, they would gather at River Run and attempt to build a coalition strong enough to challenge a queen who held the Iron Throne with an iron fist. The path before them was perilous, the cost of failure unthinkable. Yet under that weight, a small ember of hope glowed in his chest. They had come this far, survived the long night, the fall of great houses, the destruction of kingdoms. They had each other, and they had purpose. Perhaps that would be enough to spark a flame that could burn away the darkness. He lingered there a while longer, letting the night air cool his face. The sky was star-dappled, silent except for the soft rustle of wind through the grass. In the quiet, he thought of the great tasks ahead, reuniting the realm, dethroning a tyrant, and preventing even more suffering. Slowly he turned back toward the dim lights of the camp, resolved to see it through. When dawn came again, they would take another step on this long, uncertain road to River Run, to the Stormlands, and perhaps eventually to King's Landing itself. The next council, the next alliance, the next battle, all of it waited for them in the shadows. And so, with hearts braced for the trials to come, they carried on through the Riverlands, guided by hope, memory, and the iron will that had kept House Stark alive through every winter and war.